Okay, maybe we can start because it's like 10:00 now. So yeah, welcome again, everybody, and to this webinar. And the topic of today is the 6 steps of carbon footprinting and the process of carbon footprinting. And my name is Elli Latva-Hakuni, and I work as a carbon footprint analyst in Green Carbon. So here you can see the schedule of today. So first I will tell you like a couple of words about the organizer, about Green Carbon, and then it's the actual presentation. And first I will talk you about in general what is carbon footprint, and then I go through the process of carbon footprinting. And in the end of this presentation, there is also time for you to ask questions and present comments. And questions can be written on the chat. And also you can use your microphone after the presentation. And Saya is hosting the chat. Saya is also working in our company. Yes. So let's start about the Green Carbon. We are a Finnish company, first of all. Most of our staff work in Jyväskylä, which is the city in central of Finland. And we have 3 kinds of services. First, there is the carbon management. So we do the carbon footprint calculations. And also, based on these results, we make emission reduction or carbon neutrality plans for corporate clients. Yeah. And then we have offsetting services. So we produce offsetting units. If your company wants to offset those non-avoidable emissions, what your company is causing, you can buy offsetting units. And our way to produce those units is like forest-based solutions. So we enhance the forest growth. And though this growth is the carbon sink and are sold as the offset units. And these carbon sinks projects, we work together with the Finnish land and forest owners. And we are the first Nordic company to achieve ISO standard to our method. So we have like standardized method for our offsetting, and that's important. And then the third service that we have is the information systems. So we constantly look for solutions to automate the carbon management, like for example, to help use like information systems to do the carbon footprint calculations, because like nowadays it's mainly done by like human work. So overall, our company works very broadly on the topic of climate change. Yes, so let's go to the main topic of today, and let's start about the definition of carbon footprint. So carbon footprint is the total greenhouse gas emissions caused by an individual, event, organization, company, service, place, product, this kind of things. So the carbon footprint consists like different emission sources that certain unit, for example, like company has. And the results of carbon footprint are in carbon dioxide equivalence. And this is a standardized unit by EPCC. And it means that like different greenhouse gases, they have a different global warming potential. And here in this picture, you can see 6 different greenhouse gases. So the most well-known greenhouse gas is the CO2, of course, carbon dioxide. And there's the second one is the CH4, which is methane. And methane has much more stronger impact on the climate change than carbon dioxide. The same amount of these gases, the methane warms the climate much more. So this unit takes into account this difference, and also it includes like all the different greenhouse gases. So not just like carbon dioxide. And as I said, carbon footprint covers the emission sources that are in the calculated object. And here is a list in some examples of these emission sources. What's kind of like, for example, a company has. So there is like the production of raw materials, the fuels that the company uses, the electricity, transportation, heating, procurement, packaging materials, or waste management. And all these things causes greenhouse gas emissions that are included in the carbon footprint. And there are like two different kind of emission sources. So there is the direct emission sources, and those means those emissions that comes from the sources that are owned or controlled by the reporting entity. For example, if you have a factory, those fuels that you use in the factory are the direct emission sources. And then is the indirect emission sources. And this means that they come from sources that are a consequence of activities of a reporting entity, but occur at sources owned or controlled by another entity. So, for example, if we take the raw materials, the extraction of raw materials, the extraction needs energy. But this energy consumption doesn't exist in your factory and in your company's actions. So this emission source is like an indirect emission source. Yes, and there is like very different objects that you can calculate carbon footprint. But in case of like business sector, where we are now in this presentation concentrate there is two types of carbon footprints. So there is like the corporate carbon footprint, which means that we calculate the climate impact of the whole company. And then it's the product carbon footprint, which is the climate impact of the certain product. And now we look a little bit closer about the corporate carbon footprint. So the corporate carbon footprint consists the three different categories. So all the emission sources that are included in the corporate carbon footprint are classified as three categories. And those categories are named as scopes. So scope 1, 2, and 3. And in this picture, in the middle, you can see the scope 1 emissions, which means that those direct emissions, for example, the fuels in your factory, or if you have your own cars, the fuels that you use in those vehicles are your scope 1 emissions. And then there's the scope 2, which means the electricity that you buy from an electricity company. Or, for example, heating also goes here. And then the scope 3 covers basically all the rest emission sources. So there is a lot of different things, like, for example, the raw materials, business travel, waste management, or if you buy the transport for another company, it goes to the scope 3 emissions. So now you can wonder why we have to do this, why we have to kind of classify, okay, this emission source is like scope 3 emission source. It is because like scope 1 and 2 are considered to be those emission sources that are directly from your own operations. And scope 3 comes from the value chain. So it's the emissions that comes from the value chain of your company. The corporate carbon footprint is measured yearly. So usually, if you start calculating the carbon footprint this year, you calculate the previous year carbon footprint, like the 2020 carbon footprint, because you have the information for the whole year, like the previous year. You don't know the numbers of the required data in this year. So usually it's a calendar year that you measure the corporate carbon footprint. And then the product carbon footprint. It means the total sum of emissions produced throughout the product life cycle. So we don't calculate only those emissions that your company are causing, but it has to include like the whole life cycle. And in the right side, you can see like simplified picture about the different life cycle of products. So there is the material extraction, and then is the actual production of the product. And when the product is ready, it is distributed, and there's retail, storage, causes emissions. And then the product ends up to the consumer, and there is the use phase of the product, and end of life. It means like disposal or recycling those product materials. So all of these life stages should be included in product carbon footprint. This slide, I want to like clarify the difference between product and corporate carbon footprint. So in the middle, you can see again like different life cycle stages. And as I said before, product carbon footprint covers all of them. And corporate carbon footprint covers part of those life cycles. And scope 1 and 2, it's those emissions that come from your own operations. And then there is the upstream value chain emissions, like those emissions that comes from before your own operations, like for example the raw material production. And then there can be also downstream emissions, for example the distribution, or if you have like produce waste, the waste management is also like goes downstream to the value chain emissions. So corporate footprint covers scope 1, 2, and 3. And if you are now wondering, okay, should I like calculate the carbon footprint of my company or a product? It depends what is the goal of your calculation process. So if the goal is that, okay, we want to figure out our carbon footprint so we can make a emission reduction plan and make like efficient reduction actions. So then it's the corporate carbon footprint, because when you calculate it, you get a good picture about the biggest emission sources, for example. So you know what emission sources you should concentrate in when you like start to plan those reduction actions. And product carbon footprint. So if you, for example, like you're like developing a product, or you want to make your product more energy efficient. So, and then you conduct a carbon footprint calculation. So you see which life stages causes the biggest emissions. So then you know, okay, maybe we should concentrate on this, like to decrease this life cycle emissions. If it's like a use phase, or if it's like, for example, the manufacturing of the item. Yes. So that was the quick introduction about the carbon footprints in the business sector, let's say like that. And now I will go through the process of carbon footprinting. And here you can see the 6 steps. And after this, I will go through like more closely each step. But now I just read through so you get the overall picture. So number 1 is to decide the method and define the boundaries. Number 2 is data collection, and when you have the data, you apply emission factors. And then you have the results, so you write the report and make an emission reduction plan, and lastly, you communicate those results. But let's start number 1. So first, you have to, of course, decide what is the goal. Do I calculate the carbon corporate, or do I calculate the product carbon footprint? And then you have to think about those boundaries. In case of like corporate carbon footprint, there is 2 kind of boundaries that we have to think about. There is this organizational boundaries, and this is usually if you have like big company, it's more important than if you have small or medium scale. But it means that if you own parts of other companies, or if you have subsidiaries, if you have sister companies, then you have to decide whether you include those emissions also in your company's carbon footprint. Then there's the operational boundary, which everyone has to think about. And it's about like what emission sources I include in my calculations. And reasons, of course, we try to cover like all the emission sources, but that might be an impossible task. So there is like a couple of reasons why we exclude some emission sources. For example, let's say that your company has 50 different raw materials, but only 5 have like very minor role. And in case, especially if it's hard to get the data about those 5 minor ingredients, or if it's hard to get the right emission factors. So you can say that, okay, we exclude them because they have so minor role in our production. And it's hard to get the required information. And the other reason why to exclude some emission sources is that you lack of data. But if you have a lack of data, you can say that, okay, in this year we exclude this emission source because we don't have the data about the previous year. But you should like work to get the method to get the required data from the following years. And about the method, it's important that the calculations are based on some standards. And the most used standard is the greenhouse gas protocol. And it's the most used, and it's available for free in the internet. And it has different standards for corporate and product level. But for example, this standard says that you have to include the scope 1 and 2 emissions, and then scope 3 is emissions. You choose those that are relevant for your company. And I highly suggest that you follow some standard, because it's like greenhouse gas protocol gives you a good guidance to do it, but it also gives the calculations like reliability, because you can say that, okay, we followed this standard, and these calculations meet those requirements of the standard. So when you have the boundaries, you have decided, okay, we're going to include these emission sources. Then you start to collect the data. And I just want to highlight that the accuracy of the calculations, they relies a lot about the collected data. So like allocate time to this phase, especially if you are doing this the first time, it may take time to figure it out where I found this information. But also like develop a method from the following years, like how the data is collected, also during the year, maybe not just before the calculation should begin. And in the green box, there is a couple of examples what kind of data. Electricity is emission sources that almost every company has. So you have to find out the kilowatt hours from example meter readings or bills, or asking directly from the electricity company. Usually you get the report also from there. And then transport, for example, you need the fuel consumption by fuel type, for example diesel, from the fuel cards or fuel bills, for example. Or if you don't have this information, you can use kilometers per fuel and vehicle type. And this is usually the case in calculations, that you have several options, but the other options are more accurate than the others. Then you have the data. So you apply emission factors. Emission factors is a coefficient to convert the data into greenhouse gas emissions. And in the green box, I have one example. So this example is the consumption of fuel in your company-owned cars. And let's say that your company consumes diesel 1,400 liters per year. So the emission factors factor I took from the Tilastokeskus, which is the statistical center in Finland. So it's like a reliable source to take emission factor information. And it's 2.5 kilograms CO2 equivalent per liter of diesel. So we just multiply these numbers, and the result is 2,330 kilograms CO2 equivalent. And notice that this unit is a mass unit. So it makes a huge difference if the unit is like kilograms or tons. It can also be like grams if it's like very small thing. So yeah, so let's pay attention to this, because it makes a huge difference from the numbers. Yes, it is important to connect like correct emission factor to correct data. And in case of like this example in diesel, it's quite simple, because we have diesel and then we can see that, okay, the diesel emission factor is this. But if you have like, for example, the raw materials, make sure that the emission factor and the raw material is actually the same material and from the same material. And if you have like raw material or component that consists several raw materials, you have to make sure that the emission factor is also correct. So where you can find emission factors? First of all, you can ask directly from the companies in your value chain. If the company, for example, the raw material company has calculated its product's carbon footprints, you can use those numbers to calculate also your carbon footprint of raw materials. And usually, like electricity producers, they have those numbers, they have those emission factors. So yeah, I highly suggest that you ask the electricity producers for the emission factors. And also, like Finnish Statistical Center, they produce the like general emission factors. For example, what is the electricity, the consumed electricity in Finland? What is the emission factor for that? But this is a general information, and if you can get the emission factors directly from your electricity producers, it's much more accurate. And also emission factors can be found in different databases. So for example, EcoInvent, it's a database it's not for free, it needs license. And CO2 data and Lipasto is from Finnish context. So if you come from other countries, this is not for you. But CO2 data is from construction materials, and Lipasto is for transportation. And then you can also find carbon footprint calculators in the internet. In Finland, we have Y-hiilari and ilmastolaskuri, and for example, and there you can apply the data, and then the calculator gives you the correct emission factors. And also, if you struggle with this phase, you can also ask help, like consultation companies like Green Carbon, because we have the expertise to connect and found like correct emission factors for your data. And also we have these licensed databases which we can use. So now you have the results. So then the result has to be combined. And here is a table. You can see one example. This is in case of restaurant. What is the conclusion kind of? So there is the used emission sources, and then the absolute emissions, and then the share of those emissions about the whole carbon footprint. Of course, the results, you should also look closer, for example, food, like what is the emissions that causes, like, or biggest ingredients that causes the most emissions in the food emission source. But you have this kind of results, then you can know that, okay, maybe I should put a lot of effort to reduce the food emissions compared to put a lot of effort to reduce the water consumption, for example. And then you write a report, and report you of course present the results, but in addition to that, you mention the methods that you use, the standard that you use, the emission sources that are included and are excluded, and you justify the choices, and also the emission factors and the sources where you took those emission factors. And now you have the result. So let's make an emission reduction plan. So first of all, you set the target. And here is like one example, what kind of target could look like. And then you identify the actions in your own operations, but also in the value chain. And of course, in the value chain, you don't have so much control about the actions, but you have like also, you can make also actions to reduce the value chain emissions. Like, for example, changing the supplier, or require certain things, or require like that the manufacturer uses renewable energy, for example. And then you monitor the development and do the calculations yearly. So this last step is to communicate the results. So it's important to communicate the results internally. So you engage the employees in the reduction actions, and you tell about the current situation and the future plans to reduce the climate impact. And also communicate externally. So you provide information, for example, to consumers, stakeholders, investors, about the results, of course, but also, as I said, like the methods and emission sources and emission factors. And if you have then offset some emissions, please tell the absolute emissions that your company causes. And then you say that, okay, then we have offset these emissions and tell about what kind offsetting units you used to offset those emissions. This is kind of good way to report emissions or report carbon footprint. So yeah, the keyword is transparent. Please remember to be transparent, because it also gives a good impression about your company if you are telling like all these things, and consumers or stakeholders can look how you conduct the carbon footprint calculations. In the end of my presentation, I want to highlight why you should do the carbon footprinting. So this is the first step to manage and reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, because then you know like what kind of emission reduction plan and what kind of actions I should concentrate in. And it's also a part of corporate social responsibility, and it improves the sustainability reporting. And it also improves your brand value when you tell openly, okay, this is my carbon footprint, and this is those actions that we are taking to reduce it. And nowadays, we know that customers, stakeholders, investors, they have a lot of requirements for companies to report also the climate impact. So we meet those requirements, and also like the regulations are tightening all the time, and big companies, they already should report the scope 1 and 2 emissions. And the trend is that also scope 3 emissions should be included in the carbon footprint. So better start now than later. Okay, thank you. This was my presentation. And here is my information. You are very welcome to always write an email for me or a message from by LinkedIn. And if your company have some needs regarding to carbon footprint, Green Carbon is of course very willing to help you with these issues and carbon management overall. So thank you, and now there is time for questions or comments. That's also very welcome. So yeah, you can write in the chat, or then put the microphone on and present the question that way. Let's wait a bit if somebody is typing. There is the, yeah. If my company includes, for example, the emissions of raw materials in our carbon footprint, these emissions also are included from other companies' carbon footprint. Is this double counting? Yeah, this is a good question about the double counting, and we all have maybe heard about the problem of double counting. And it is a problem if you calculate, for example, the carbon footprint of a government or a municipality. Then you don't want to count twice the same emissions, because you want like very realistic picture. But in the business sector and in the corporate sector, this is a little bit different, because those emissions that comes from the scope 3, they are in the value chain emissions. So they are also included in other companies' carbon footprint. But if you also include those scope 3 emissions to your carbon footprint, this has like very many advantages, because then you get a very large and broad picture about the climate impact. And usually, if your company are in manufacturing sector, service sector, the scope 3 emissions cause like the majority of the emissions. So then you can get like very broad picture about the climate impact of your company. And that's why it's important that those Scope 3 emissions are included, even though they are included in other companies' carbon footprint. But we have the Scope 1 and 2, and especially like Scope 1, it should not be counted. The Scope 1 emissions should not be counted as Scope 1 emissions for another company. I don't know, was this clear? but this was a good question. So if the company generates like negative carbon emissions, I think this is, for example, in case if you have company, if you produce like wood-based products, when the carbon that's is in the wood are bigger than the carbon footprint of your company. And in this case, if you follow the greenhouse gas protocol standards, you should report the absolute emissions that your company has, and then you should report those CO2 emissions that are in the product, in the wood, I mean. So what comes to the greenhouse gas protocol, you should report this separately. And about the that if you produce offset units, is there like a common platform or transaction? There is like certificates, like golden standard, which can certify your offsetting units, and that's the way to sell them. Yeah, and then there's about the categories of Scope 3. Yeah, the Scope 3 have 15 different categories. And now I can't figure it out. Did I mention only 5? This was not the purpose. If I just like picked up 5, it was just like example to do it if there was in the list in the emission sources. So it was just an example. Yeah, they have 15 and they are like equal important, let's say this way. Yeah. And about those 15 categories, you kind of pick those that is relevant for your company, because companies, they are so different that all of companies doesn't have all those 15 categories emissions. But yeah, good clarifying question. Okay, I think that was all the questions. Thank you for it. And nobody is now typing any more messages. And yeah, thank you for listening, and thank you for participating this webinar. And the webinar, the record of the webinar will be in Green Carbon's website also, so you can go for it later also. So thank you, and have a nice day. Bye.